They say the hardest part of betrayal is that it never comes from your enemies. Your enemies are honest in their malice. They stand in front of you, look you in the eye, and show you exactly who they are. No, the most profound, soul-destroying betrayals come from the people sitting across from you at the dinner table, the ones who kiss your forehead when you have a fever, the ones who hold your hand at your parents' funerals, the ones who call you family. My name is Clara Hayes. I am 32 years old, though looking back at the last 8 years of my life, I feel as though I've lived a lifetime's worth of deceit. I'm sharing my story not for pity, but because I know there are women listening to this right now who feel a knot in their stomach. A quiet, persistent whisper in the back of their mind, telling them that something in their perfectly arranged living room is profoundly wrong. If you are listening to this, and you feel that familiar chill of doubt, I want you to pay very close attention. Do not silence that voice. It is the only thing keeping you alive. When I met Julian Vance, I was 23. I had just inherited a substantial, self-sustaining business and a healthy trust fund from my late grandfather. I was young, grieving, overwhelmed by my new responsibilities, and desperately lonely. Julian was 26, working in real estate investment, and he was everything a young woman is conditioned to want. He was impeccably dressed, wildly charismatic, and he looked at me not like I was a spreadsheet of assets, but like I was the center of his universe. But it wasn't just Julian who swept me off my feet. It was his entire family. I was an orphan, adrift in the world, and the Vances offered me an anchor. His parents, Richard and Margaret Vance, were the picture of East Coast refinement. Richard was a retired financial consultant who smoked cigars and called me kiddo with a warm, fatherly chuckle. Margaret was a pristine, pearl-wearing matriarch who invited me to her country club luncheons, introduced me to her friends as her beautiful new daughter, and gave me recipes for pot roast that had supposedly been in their family for generations. Then there was Beatrice, Julian's older sister. She was sharp-tongued, a bit demanding, and fiercely protective of her brother. At first, she was cold to me, which only made me try harder to win her approval. When she finally started inviting me out for coffee and asking for my advice on her wardrobe, I felt a genuine sense of accomplishment. I had cracked the inner circle. I belonged. We married when I was 24. Looking back, the warning signs were all there, draped in the guise of traditional family values. Richard had pulled me aside before the wedding, swirling a glass of scotch, and suggested that since I was so busy running my grandfather's supply chain logistics company, Julian should take over the management of my personal portfolio. "Let the men handle the stress of the markets, Clara," Richard had said, patting my shoulder. "You focus on your business and building a home. Julian has a brilliant mind for growth. Keep it in the family." Margaret chimed in, adjusting my collar. "Marriage is about partnership, darling. What's yours is his, what's his is yours. We Vances take care of our own." I believed them. I signed the power of attorney. I gave Julian access to the accounts, trusting him to grow our wealth while I worked 60-hour weeks to keep my company thriving. And for 8 years, everything seemed flawless. We lived in a stunning penthouse. We took vacations to Aspen and Santorini. Julian was always attentive, always bringing home flowers, always ready with a back rub after a long day. He was a master of the illusion of transparency. He would occasionally show me glossy portfolios and charts, throwing around terms like diversified asset allocation and long-term yield. He told me he was moving large chunks of my income into offshore trusts and real estate developments to shield us from taxes. I didn't question it. Why would I? His father, the esteemed Richard Vance, reviewed the portfolios with him every Sunday. I trusted the men I loved. I was so incredibly naive. The first real crack in the foundation didn't happen with a lipstick stain on a collar or a late-night text message. It happened over something entirely mundane. It happened because of a lawnmower. It was Thanksgiving, just a few months ago. The air in the city had turned bitterly cold, biting through wool coats and freezing the puddles on the sidewalks. I had been looking forward to this Thanksgiving for months. I had ordered a massive heritage turkey, spent days planning the menu, and was ready to host the entire Vance family. But 3 days before the holiday, Margaret called me, her voice dripping with artificial disappointment. "Clara, darling, I am just heartbroken," she sighed into the receiver. "Richard's brother in London has taken ill. We simply have to fly out to be with him. It's a family emergency. Beatrice is coming with us to help with the arrangements. I am so sorry to leave you and Julian alone for the holiday." I was disappointed, of course, but I understood. Family comes first. That was the Vance motto. The morning of Thanksgiving, Julian woke up early. He didn't reach for me. Instead, he was pacing the bedroom, his phone pressed to his ear, his voice a tense, hushed whisper. When he hung up, he looked at me with an expression of pure, practiced panic. "Clara, I am so sorry," he said, sitting on the edge of the bed and burying his face in his hands. "It's the commercial development project in Chicago. The contractors walked off the site, and the investors are threatening to pull out. If I don't get on a plane right now and smooth this over, we could lose millions. I have to go." "On Thanksgiving?" I asked, sitting up, the chill of the room suddenly settling into my bones. I know, he pleaded, grabbing my hands and kissing my knuckles. "It kills me to leave you alone today of all days. But this is for our future, Clara. For our family. I'll make it up to you, I promise. I'll be back by Saturday." Within an hour, his bags were packed and he was out the door. I was left alone in a silent 5,000-square-foot penthouse, staring at a 20-pound turkey I had no intention of cooking. I spent the day in a haze of quiet melancholy. I poured myself a glass of red wine at noon, wrapped myself in a cashmere blanket, and decided to do some administrative work just to keep my mind occupied. I opened my laptop and logged into my primary checking account to pay the monthly maintenance fee for my grandfather's old estate, which I still owned. As I scrolled through the transactions, my eyes caught something odd. A withdrawal, $12,500. The merchant name was Oak Ridge Premier Landscaping. I frowned, bringing my wine glass to my lips. $12,000 for landscaping? In November? We lived in a penthouse. We didn't have a lawn. And my grandfather's estate had a groundskeeper on a fixed salary of $2,000 a month. I clicked on the transaction details. The clearing bank was located in a town called Crest Haven, a wealthy, secluded suburb about 2 hours north of the city. I had never been to Crest Haven. I didn't own property in Crest Haven. Julian had never mentioned any developments in Crest Haven. A strange, cold sensation began to spread from my chest, crawling up my throat. It wasn't panic yet. It was confusion, tinged with a primal instinct that I had spent 8 years suppressing. I opened a new tab and searched the landscaping company. They had a website. I found their contact number, picked up my phone, and dialed. It was Thanksgiving, so I expected it to go to voicemail. It did. "You have reached Oak Ridge Premier Landscaping. We are closed for the holiday. If this is an emergency regarding the Vance property at 412 Sycamore Drive, please leave a message and our on-call tech will respond." I froze. The phone slipped slightly in my sweating palm. The Vance property at 412 Sycamore Drive. My breath hitched. I hung up the phone. I opened another tab and pulled up the county property tax records for Crest Haven. My hands were shaking so badly I misspelled the town name twice. Finally, the search engine loaded. I typed in 412 Sycamore Drive. The page refreshed. The owner of the property was listed as the Vance Family Irrevocable Trust. A trust. Julian had set up dozens of trusts. He always told me it was standard practice. But the mailing address for this specific trust wasn't Julian's office. It wasn't our accountant's office. It was a P.O. box in Crest Haven. The cold sensation in my throat morphed into a suffocating grip. I looked at the time. It was 4 p.m. Julian's flight to Chicago would have landed hours ago. I picked up my phone and called him. It rang straight to voicemail. "Hey, it's Julian. Leave a message." I called Margaret's cell phone, supposedly in London. It rang, standard American ringtone, not the international tone, before going to voicemail. I called Beatrice. Same thing. The silence in the penthouse was no longer just lonely. It was deafening. It felt like the walls were closing in, pressing the air out of my lungs. I didn't think. I just acted. I threw off the blanket, walked to the closet, and pulled on a heavy wool coat over my sweater. I grabbed my car keys, my purse, and walked out the door. The drive to Crest Haven was a blur of black asphalt and freezing rain. The windshield wipers beat a frantic, rhythmic tempo that matched the hammering of my heart. 2 hours. 2 hours of gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white, my mind racing through every possible rational explanation. Maybe it was an investment property he was flipping. Maybe it was a surprise anniversary gift. Maybe he had bought a house for his parents and kept it a secret because why? Why would he lie about going to Chicago? Why would they lie about London? The deeper I drove into Crest Haven, the more the dread settled into my bones. This wasn't a town where you flipped houses. This was a town of sprawling estates, high wrought iron gates, and old money. The trees were massive, their bare branches clawing at the dark November sky. I turned onto Sycamore Drive. The street was wide and lined with tasteful, low-lit street lamps. I drove slowly, checking the numbers on the stone pillars guarding the driveways. 390, 400, 408, then 412. I didn't pull into the driveway. I parked my car on the shoulder of the road, 2 houses down, under the deep shadow of an ancient oak tree. I turned off the engine. The sudden silence of the car was oppressive. I stepped out into the freezing cold. The rain had stopped, leaving a heavy, icy mist in the air. I pulled my collar up against the wind and began to walk toward the property. The driveway was long, curving gently past manicured lawns. The $12,000 landscaping was evident even in the dark. At the end of the driveway sat a house. No, not a house. A mansion. It was a sprawling, colonial-style estate with white pillars, a wraparound porch, and massive bay windows that glowed with warm golden light against the black night. In the driveway, parked neatly in a row, were 3 cars. One was a silver Mercedes SUV, Beatrice's car. The second was a black Lexus sedan, Richard and Margaret's car. The third was a dark blue Porsche Cayenne, Julian's car. My breath plumed in the freezing air, coming in short, jagged gasps. My legs felt like lead, but I forced myself to keep walking, stepping off the gravel driveway and onto the damp, silent grass. I moved like a ghost, slipping through the shadows of the large oak trees that dotted the front yard, edging closer to the massive bay window on the ground floor. The curtains were drawn back, revealing a dining room that looked like something out of a magazine spread. A roaring fire crackled in a grand stone fireplace. The table was enormous, set with gleaming crystal, fine china, and a massive, perfectly roasted turkey in the center. I stood there in the freezing darkness, my hands pressed against the icy bark of a tree, and I looked into the window. Standing at the head of the table, carving the turkey with a silver electric knife, was my husband, Julian. He was wearing a casual cashmere sweater, laughing, his face flushed and relaxed. To his right sat a woman I had never seen before. She was beautiful, perhaps my age or a little older, with honey blonde hair and a warm maternal smile. She was reaching out, affectionately resting her hand on Julian's forearm as he carved. Sitting next to her was a young boy, maybe 7 years old, and a little girl, perhaps 5. They shared Julian's dark hair and the woman's bright eyes. But it wasn't the sight of the other woman or the children that shattered my reality into a million jagged pieces. It was the rest of the table. Sitting across from the woman, raising a glass of wine and a toast, was Richard Vance. Next to him, smiling adoringly at the children, was Margaret. And at the end of the table, laughing at something Julian said, was Beatrice. My family, the people who had held me when I cried over my grandfather, the people who told me I was the daughter they never had, the people who had sworn just 3 days ago that they were flying to London. They were all there, laughing, eating, celebrating. They looked so comfortable, so settled. This wasn't a secret rendezvous. This was a tradition. This was a family, their family. I stood in the dark, the freezing wind biting at my tears, and watched my husband lean down and kiss the blonde woman on the lips. I watched my mother-in-law pass the gravy to the little boy, ruffling his hair. I watched my sister-in-law clink her glass against the woman's glass. Sisters in everything but name. I didn't scream. I didn't bang on the glass. I didn't storm through the front door and demand answers. If I had been 20, maybe I would have. But at 32, a woman who has built an empire knows that acting on raw, bleeding emotion is how you lose the war. I stepped back from the window, retreating into the shadows. The cold had seeped entirely into my soul, freezing the shock and the heartbreak into something else. Something hard, something sharp, and crystalline, and utterly devoid of mercy. I turned around and walked back down the long, sweeping driveway, leaving the glowing house behind me. The gravel crunched softly under my boots. I got into my car, locked the doors, and sat in the dark for a long time. I didn't just have a cheating husband. I didn't just have an unfaithful partner. I was the victim of a coordinated psychological and financial siege engineered by an entire family. For 8 years, I had been the golden goose, the naive, orphaned girl they had chosen to fund their real lives. Every vacation, every designer suit, Every drop of gas in that Porsche and every blade of grass on this magnificent estate was paid for with my blood, my sweat, and my grandfather's legacy. I started the engine. The heater blasted warm air over my frozen hands, but I couldn't feel it. I pulled out onto the dark road, heading back toward the city. The tears had stopped completely. I wasn't Clara the loving wife anymore. I was Clara the CEO, and the Vance family had just executed a hostile takeover of my life. They thought I was just a polite, compliant girl who signed wherever she was told. They thought they had secured their future on my back. But as I drove through the black night, my mind already calculating, strategizing, and planning the utter destruction of the Vance family, I made a silent vow. I was going to take it all back. Every single dime, every ounce of dignity. And when I was finished with them, they wouldn't even have the dirt beneath their manicured lawns to call their own. The war had begun, and they didn't even know I was on the battlefield. The drive back to the city that Thanksgiving night was a masterclass in dissociation. By the time I pulled into the underground garage of our building, my tears had dried into a stiff, salty mask on my face. I rode the elevator up to the penthouse, unlocked the door, and stepped into the suffocating warmth of the life I had built for a ghost. The 20-pound heritage turkey was still sitting on the granite kitchen island, thawing in its pristine vacuum-sealed packaging. It was a symbol of my domestic devotion, my desperation to create the perfect holiday for a family that was currently digesting a different bird, bought with my money, carved by my husband, in a house I unknowingly owned. I didn't cry. I picked up the turkey, walked over to the stainless steel trash can, stepped on the pedal, and dropped it in. The heavy thud it made as it hit the bottom sounded exactly like a gavel coming down. Julian came home on Saturday afternoon. I heard the lock click, heard the familiar heavy sigh he always let out to signal how exhausting it was to be the man providing for our future. He walked into the living room, dropping his leather duffel bag, a gift I had bought him for our 3rd anniversary, onto the floor. He looked tired, but it wasn't the haggard exhaustion of a man who had spent 3 days fighting hostile contractors in Chicago. It was the comfortable, cozy lethargy of a man who had eaten too much pie, played too much flag football on a sprawling lawn, and slept deeply in the arms of his actual wife. "God, what a nightmare," he groaned, rubbing his temples as he walked toward me. "The unions up there are ruthless, Clara, but I saved it. The investors are happy." He leaned in and kissed me on the forehead. It took every ounce of self-control I possessed, every shred of discipline I had learned in corporate boardrooms, not to recoil. I forced my muscles to relax. I forced my lips to curve into a sympathetic smile. Up close, I could smell the faint, lingering scent of a wood-burning fireplace on his sweater. We didn't have a wood-burning fireplace in our penthouse, but I had seen a magnificent one blazing behind him through the window on Sycamore Drive. "I'm so glad, Julian," I said, my voice steady, smooth as glass. "You worked too hard for us. Go take a hot shower. I'll order some dinner." "You're an angel," he murmured, squeezing my shoulder before heading to the master bathroom. As soon as I heard this water running, I walked over to his discarded duffel bag. I didn't rummage through his clothes. He was too smart to leave a stray blonde hair or a child's drawing in his luggage. Instead, I unzipped the small side pocket where he kept his travel receipts. There was a crumbled gas station receipt. I smoothed it out. It was time-stamped Friday morning from a Chevron station in Cresthaven. He hadn't even bothered to pay in cash. He was getting sloppy, drunk on his own invincibility. I took a photo of it with my phone and slipped it back exactly as I had found it. The hardest part wasn't the anger. The anger was a fuel I could use. The hardest part was the physical revulsion. Sleeping in the same bed with him that night, feeling the heat of his body radiating against my back, I felt like I was lying next to a corpse. I was sharing a bed with a stranger who wore my husband's face. On Monday morning, Julian left for his office, kissing my cheek and telling me he loved me. I waited exactly 10 minutes. Then I bypassed my own office and drove straight to the financial district. I didn't go to the wealth management firm Julian used. I went to a man my grandfather had once told me to call if I ever found myself in a situation where the police would be too blunt an instrument. His name was Arthur Sterling. Arthur's office didn't look like a typical law firm. There were no mahogany bookshelves lined with leather-bound volumes, no plush Persian rugs meant to put clients at ease. It was stark, minimalist, encased in glass and steel. Arthur himself was a man in his early 50s with silver hair cropped impeccably close to his scalp, wearing a bespoke suit that cost more than a mid-sized sedan. He didn't exude warmth. He exuded absolute, terrifying competence. I sat across from his pristine glass desk and laid out what I knew. I told him about the Thanksgiving lie, the $12,000 landscaping bill, the drive to Cresthaven, and the picturesque family dinner I had witnessed through the glass. I spoke clinically, detached, as if I were giving a quarterly earnings report on a failing subsidiary. Arthur listened without interrupting, his pale blue eyes fixed on me, his hands steepled under his chin. When I finished, the silence in the room stretched for a long minute. "Most women in your position would be in my office crying, Mrs. Hayes," Arthur finally said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone. "Or they would have already confronted him and hired a divorce attorney who charges by the hour to hold their hand." "I don't need my hand held, Mr. Sterling," I replied evenly. "I need an autopsy of my life, and then I need a weapon." The corner of Arthur's mouth twitched upward by a fraction of a millimeter. It was the closest thing to a smile I would ever see from him. "Very well. Give me 48 hours and unfettered access to your primary banking credentials. Do exactly as you have been doing. Smile at your husband. Ask him about his day. Do not change a single password yet." Those 48 hours were an exercise in psychological torture. Margaret and Richard returned from their fictional trip to London on Wednesday. They invited Julian and me over to their townhouse for dinner to make up for missing Thanksgiving. I sat at their antique dining table, drinking their expensive wine, while Margaret regaled me with stories of the dreary London weather and how much they had missed me. "We bought you a lovely cashmere scarf at Harrods, Clara darling," Margaret said, patting my hand affectionately. Her eyes were warm, maternal. "Thank you, Margaret," I smiled back, looking into the eyes of a woman who just days prior had been passing gravy to her secret grandchildren in a house bought with my stolen money. "You're always so thoughtful." Beatrice, sitting across from me, swirled her wine glass. "You really should have seen the West End show we caught, Clara, though I know you're always too busy working to enjoy the finer things." "Someone has to keep the lights on," Julian chuckled, winking at me. The entire table laughed. A warm, happy family joke. I looked at all of them. Richard carving the roast beef, Margaret pouring the wine, Beatrice offering her backhanded compliments, Julian playing the devoted husband. They were a symphony of sociopaths. They didn't just tolerate the lie, they reveled in it. They enjoyed the thrill of sitting across from the mark, eating food paid for by her labor, acting out a play they had rehearsed 1,000 times. On Friday morning, I returned to Arthur Sterling's office. When I sat down, there was a thick manila folder resting exactly in the center of his desk. Arthur didn't offer a greeting. He simply opened the folder and slid a single sheet of paper across the glass toward me. It was a photocopy of a document from the State Archives. "I ran a comprehensive background check on Julian Vance," Arthur said, his tone entirely devoid of emotion. "And I cross-referenced the address you provided in Cresthaven. The woman you saw carving the turkey with Julian is named Bethany Ann Miller, now Bethany Ann Vance." I looked down at the paper. It was a marriage certificate. Julian Robert Vance and Bethany Ann Miller, dated 10 years ago. 2 years before he even met me. "There is no record of a divorce," Arthur continued smoothly. "I checked every county, every state. They are legally married, which means, Clara, your marriage to Julian 8 years ago was never legally binding. You are not a wife. In the eyes of the law, you are a victim of bigamy." I stared at Julian's signature on the decade-old document. The letters were identical to the way he signed our anniversary cards. The air left my lungs in a slow, jagged exhale. I had prepared myself for infidelity. I had prepared myself for embezzlement. But this? "So, I'm nothing," I whispered, the reality of my non-existent status washing over me. "I'm just the mistress with the checkbook." "You are the mark," Arthur corrected bluntly. "But the bigamy is actually the least of their problems. It's simply the mechanism they use to commit the real crime." He slid a stack of financial documents across the desk. They were printouts of my own trust accounts, Julian's LLCs, and offshore holding companies. They were covered in yellow highlighter and red ink. "Julian didn't just skim a little off the top for a mistress," Arthur explained, tapping a manicured finger on a ledger. "He set up a parallel financial ecosystem. You see this LLC, Apex Holdings? Julian told you it was a commercial real estate venture. It's not. It's the entity that owns the deed to the Cresthaven property. He funneled your grandfather's inheritance into Apex to buy that house outright. He flipped to another page. The $12,000 landscaping bill, paid from your emergency fund. The private school tuition for Bethany's 2 children, funneled through an educational charity trust you signed off on 3 years ago. The silver Mercedes your sister-in-law Beatrice drives, leased under your company's corporate fleet account. My stomach churned violently. It was a hemorrhage. They had attached themselves to my veins and had been drinking deeply for almost a decade. But here is the detail that elevates this from a tragic domestic dispute to a federal conspiracy, Arthur said, his eyes finally flashing with a predator's excitement. He slid 3 more papers toward me. They were transfer deeds, trust formations, and tax declarations. Look at the witness signatures. Look at the notarizations. I leaned in. At the bottom of the deed transferring the Cresthaven house to the Apex LLC, the witness signature was a bold, looping script. Richard Vance. On the trust documents that funneled my money into the children's tuition, the listed co-trustee was Beatrice Vance. Julian didn't do this alone, Arthur said quietly. He couldn't have. He needed Richard's financial expertise to bypass the fail-safes your grandfather left in place. He needed Beatrice to manage the day-to-day transfers locally while he played the busy husband with you. And he needed Margaret to play the loving mother-in-law to keep you docile, trusting, and deeply embedded in their web. I stared at the signatures. The sheer scale of the betrayal was paralyzing. This wasn't a man who made a mistake and got in too deep, desperately trying to juggle 2 lives. This was a predatory family syndicate. They had targeted me, an orphaned 23-year-old heiress with no parents to protect her, no siblings to question the paperwork. They had groomed me, isolated me with their fake affection, and systematically dismantled my wealth to build an empire for Julian's real family. Bethany knew too, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. She had to know. Oh, she knows, Arthur confirmed. I pulled her credit history. She hasn't worked a day in 10 years. Her name is on the joint accounts that receive the dividends from Julian's shell companies. She is sitting in a $2 million estate, raising her children on your dime, fully aware that her husband is playing house with a wealthy woman in the city to fund their lifestyle. I closed my eyes. The image of Margaret passing the gravy, of Beatrice clinking glasses with Bethany, of Richard toasting the table. It wasn't just a happy family dinner. It was a board of directors celebrating a highly successful 8-year-long corporate heist. If you go to the police right now with the bigamy, Arthur warned, leaning back in his chair, Julian will get arrested. It will be a scandal. But bigamy is often treated as a low-level felony. He might do a year in a white-collar facility. And during that time, Richard and Beatrice will liquidate the offshore accounts, sell the Cresthaven house, and hide the money. You will spend a decade in civil court trying to claw back pennies on the dollar, while they live comfortably in a non-extradition country. I opened my eyes and looked at Arthur. The shock was gone. The grief was gone. What remained was a cold, absolute clarity. They had treated me like a bank. They had viewed my life, my youth, and my love as nothing more than raw capital to be exploited. I don't want pennies on the dollar, Arthur, I said, my voice eerily calm. And I don't just want Julian in a jail cell. What do you want, Clara? I want everything, I stated, leaning over the glass desk. I want the Cresthaven house. I want the offshore accounts. I want the clothes off Beatrice's back and the pension Richard thinks he has. I want to see Margaret Vance humiliated in front of the country club she parades around in. I want to bankrupt every single one of them, legally, methodically, and permanently. Arthur Sterling looked at me for a long time. Then, very slowly, he reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a fresh blank legal pad. A scorched earth campaign, he mused, uncapping his gold fountain pen. Excellent. The law is a very blunt instrument, Clara, but in the right hands, it can be a scalpel. They built this empire using your money and their fraudulent signatures. We are going to use those exact same signatures to build a cage they can never escape. He looked up at me, his eyes gleaming with the thrill of the hunt. You will have to go back to that penthouse. You will have to kiss him. You will have to attend Sunday dinners with Richard and Margaret. You will have to be the perfect, blind, adoring wife for just a little while longer. Can you do that? I thought of the Thanksgiving turkey in the trash. I thought of Julian's smug, tired face. I ran a company by the time I was 22, Arthur, I said, a dangerous, razor-thin smile touching my lips. I know how to manage a hostile work environment, Tell me what to sign. Living with a parasite requires a very specific kind of dissociation. For the next 2 months, I became an actress in a play where I was the only one who knew it was a tragedy. I woke up every morning, brewed Julian his favorite dark roast coffee, and kissed his cheek before he left for work. I listened to his fabricated stories about difficult clients and stressful board meetings with wide, sympathetic eyes. I attended Sunday brunches with Richard and Margaret, eating scones and listening to them debate the merits of different country club memberships, all while knowing they were plotting my financial ruin between sips of mimosas. It was exhausting. It was physically painful. Every time Julian touched me, my skin crawled. Every time Beatrice called me sister, I tasted bile in the back of my throat. But I used that revulsion. I channeled it into a cold, diamond-hard focus. While Julian slept, dreaming of his other life in Cresthaven, I worked. I memorized the rhythm of his breathing. When it deepened into the heavy cadence of REM sleep, I would slip out of bed, bypass the alarm system I had secretly rewired, and enter his home office. Julian was arrogant, and arrogant men always make mistakes. He believed I was completely technologically illiterate when it came to finance. He kept a biometric safe hidden behind a bookshelf, but he had a terrible habit of wiping his thumb on the mahogany desk before pressing it to the scanner. A little graphite dust and a piece of clear tape were all it took to lift his print. Inside the safe, I found the Holy Grail, the encrypted hard drive containing the raw, unfiltered ledgers of the Apex LLC and the offshore accounts. I copied everything. Every tax evasion scheme, every forged signature, every wire transfer that funneled my grandfather's legacy into Bethany's lap. I handed it all over to Arthur Sterling. Arthur was a maestro of destruction. We met twice a week in his glass-walled office, constructing the guillotine. "The Vance family operates on a fundamental weakness, Clara," Arthur said one rainy Tuesday, reviewing the copied ledgers. "Greed. They have been siphoning your wealth slowly, carefully, so as not to kill the host. We are going to offer them a feast so massive, they will choke on it." Arthur's plan was a masterpiece of legal entrapment. Using my grandfather's logistics company as the bait, Arthur drafted a labyrinthine set of documents for a new entity, the Hayes Vance Global Syndicate. The narrative we constructed was that my company was about to merge with a European shipping giant, resulting in a liquid windfall of over $50 million. However, to shield this new, massive wealth from corporate taxes, we needed to consolidate all existing family assets into a singular, impenetrable master trust. "If they sign this," Arthur explained, tapping the thick stack of watermarked paper, "they are legally pledging the Cresthaven property, the Apex LLC, Beatrice's shell companies, and Richard's offshore accounts as collateral into a trust that you are the sole beneficiary of, under the guise of an executive tax shield. The clauses are buried under 40 pages of dense legalese. Because Richard fancies himself a financial genius, he won't hire an outside firm to review it. He will read it himself, see the $50 million at the end of the tunnel, and sign his own death warrant." The execution of the trap was almost too easy. I pitched the idea to Julian over a candlelit dinner in our penthouse. I played the overwhelmed, exhausted CEO perfectly. I told him the merger was happening, the money was astronomical, and I simply couldn't manage it. I told him I needed his brilliant mind and his father's expertise to protect our future. The look in Julian's eyes was sickening. It was the look of a starving wolf staring at an open sheep pen. He took the bait completely. 2 days later, we sat in the Vance family townhouse. Richard Vance put on his reading glasses and spent 2 hours pretending to scrutinize Arthur's documents. I sat on the velvet sofa, sipping tea, watching the greed war with the caution in the old man's eyes. But the lure of $50 million was too much. The phantom European merger blinded him to the razor wire hidden in the text. "It's an aggressive consolidation, Clara," Richard finally said, taking off his glasses and giving me a patronizing smile. "But Julian and I can manage the risk. It's the smart play to protect the family's new wealth." One by one they signed. Julian signed away the Apex LLC. Beatrice signed over the dummy accounts she used to lease her cars. Richard and Margaret signed over the deeds they had fraudulently witnessed. They thought they were locking me out. They didn't realize Arthur Sterling had just handed me the legal keys to every single thing they owned. The trap had snapped shut, and they couldn't even feel the steel teeth in their legs. With the legal cage locked, it was time to build the stage. Our 8th wedding anniversary was approaching. Julian, flush with the anticipation of his impending $50 million payday, insisted on throwing a massive party. He wanted to show off. He wanted to stand in front of the New York elite and play the king. I agreed enthusiastically. I booked the grand ballroom at the Pierre Hotel. I spared no expense. I invited 200 guests. The board members of my company, the partners at Julian's real estate firm, Margaret's entire country club social circle, and every high-net-worth investor Richard Vance had ever tried to impress. I even sent a discreet, anonymous invitation to the Cresthaven P.O. box, knowing Bethany wouldn't dare show up, but wanting her to know the exact moment her world ended. The night of the anniversary was a spectacle of diamonds, silk, and hypocrisy. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over the ballroom. Waiters carried trays of vintage champagne. A string quartet played softly in the corner. I wore a floor-length emerald green gown that cost more than most people's cars. Julian wore a custom Tom Ford tuxedo. He paraded me around the room by the small of my back, accepting congratulations, shaking hands, playing the devoted, successful husband to perfection. Margaret and Richard held court near the ice sculpture, bragging to their friends about the massive European merger their brilliant son was brokering for his wife. Beatrice was dripping in jewels, bought with my money, laughing loudly with the wives of banking executives. At 10 o'clock, the quartet stopped playing. Julian tapped his champagne flute with a silver fork. The melodic clinking echoed through the ballroom, and a hush fell over the crowd. 200 faces turned toward the grand staircase where Julian and I stood. "Family, friends, esteemed colleagues," Julian began, his voice projecting with practiced charisma. He turned to me, taking my hands in his. 8 years ago, I married the most incredible woman in the world. Clara, you are my rock. You are the foundation of this family. Everything I do, every late night at the office, every sacrifice, has been to build a beautiful life for us. A collective awe rippled through the older women in the crowd. Margaret dabbed at her eyes with a silk handkerchief. "We've had an incredible journey," Julian continued, flashing his perfect teeth. "And tonight, Clara has prepared a short video presentation to take us down memory lane. To my beautiful wife, I love you." He raised his glass. The room raised their glasses. "To Clara and Julian." Julian stepped back, gesturing to the massive projector screen that had been lowered against the far wall. The lights in the ballroom dimmed to a dramatic, theater-like darkness. I stepped up to the microphone. The microphone stand was cold against my palms. I looked out over the sea of faces. I saw Richard's smug satisfaction. I saw Beatrice's envious glare. I saw Julian waiting for a montage of our vacations to Aspen and Paris. "Julian is right," I said, my voice echoing clearly through the massive room. "Everything he has done for the last 8 years has been about building a life for his family. And tonight, I think it's only fair that we celebrate all of his family." I pressed the button on the remote in my hand. The screen flashed to life, but it wasn't a picture of our wedding day. It was the high-resolution scan of the marriage certificate from 10 years ago. Julian Robert Vance and Bethany Ann Miller. The dates were highlighted in glaring neon yellow. A murmur of confusion rippled through the crowd. Someone in the back nervously chuckled, thinking it was an avant-garde joke. Julian's face went entirely slack. The color drained from his cheeks so fast he looked like a wax figure. "Clara," he hissed, stepping toward me. "What is this?" I ignored him and pressed the button again. The screen changed. It was a crystal-clear, time-stamped photograph of Julian, Bethany, Richard, Margaret, and Beatrice sitting around the Thanksgiving table in Cresthaven. They were laughing. The turkey was perfectly roasted. The date, printed in bold red across the bottom, was the exact day Julian was supposedly saving a failing project in Chicago. The murmur in the crowd escalated into a sharp, collective gasp. Women covered their mouths. Men adjusted their ties, suddenly deeply uncomfortable. "For 8 years, I spoke into the microphone, my voice cutting through the rising panic in the room like a scalpel. I believed I was a wife. I was not. I was an ATM. For 8 years, Julian Vance has been committing felony bigamy. He never divorced his first wife, Bethany. He simply moved to the city, targeted an orphaned woman with a trust fund, and married me in a sham ceremony to finance his real life." "Turn that off!" Richard Vance bellowed from the crowd, his face purple with rage. He was pushing through the guests, knocking a tray of champagne out of a waiter's hands. "Turn it off right now." I pressed the button a third time. The screen filled with the offshore ledgers, the wire transfers, and the fraudulent deeds. I had color-coded them. Every time my money went into the Apex LLC to pay for Bethany's mansion, a red arrow pointed directly to Richard and Beatrice's witness signatures. He didn't act alone, I continued, my voice rising over the growing chaos in the ballroom. The entire Vance family was complicit. Richard and Beatrice Vance signed fraudulent documents to launder my grandfather's estate into Julian's secret household. Margaret Vance invited me to Sunday dinners while babysitting the children her son was hiding from me. They didn't just steal my money, they stole my 20s. They stole my reality. "You crazy bitch!" Julian screamed. The mask of the charismatic gentleman shattered completely. His face contorted into something ugly, violent, and desperate. He lunged at me, his hands reaching for my throat. He never made it. From the shadows near the edge of the stage, Arthur Sterling stepped forward. He didn't raise his voice. He simply signaled with a slight nod of his head. The heavy oak doors of the ballroom burst open. 6 uniformed NYPD officers, accompanied by 2 men in federal windbreakers, marched into the room. The crowd parted like the Red Sea. Margaret Vance screamed. Beatrice dropped her champagne glass, the crystal shattering loudly against the marble floor. 2 officers grabbed Julian, slamming him face first onto the stage, right in front of the projector screen displaying his crimes. The sound of his jaw hitting the polished wood echoed loudly. "Julian Vance," one of the federal agents announced, pulling Julian's arms behind his back. "You are under arrest for wire fraud, bank fraud, tax evasion, and felony bigamy." As the silver handcuffs clicked loudly around Julian's wrists, I looked out into the crowd. Richard Vance was clutching his chest, leaning heavily against a pillar, his reputation utterly annihilated in front of every investor he had ever courted. Margaret was sobbing hysterically, sinking to her knees in her designer gown. Beatrice was trying to back away, trying to hide in the crowd, but the eyes of New York's elite were locked onto her, filled with absolute disgust. Julian was hauled to his feet. His custom tuxedo was rumpled, his nose was bleeding, and his eyes met mine. They were filled with sheer terror. He finally realized that the naive, compliant girl he thought he married had just burned his entire world to the ground. "You signed the consolidation trust yesterday, Julian," I whispered, stepping close enough so only he could hear me over the din of the panicked ballroom. "Everything you own, everything your father owns, the house in Cresthaven, it's all legally mine now. You have nothing." I watched the police drag my husband out of the grand ballroom in handcuffs, bathed in the flashing blue and red lights of the squad cars waiting outside. I took a slow, deep breath, smoothing the skirt of my emerald gown. The first battle was over. It was an absolute massacre. But the war wasn't finished yet. Bethany was still sitting in my house, and I was coming for her next. The silence in the penthouse the morning after the anniversary party was not the suffocating silence of loneliness. It was the crisp, clean silence of a battlefield after the smoke has cleared and the enemy has been utterly decimated. I woke up at 6 in the morning, made myself a cup of Earl Grey tea, and sat by the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the sun rise over Manhattan. I felt lighter than I had in a decade. The parasite had been surgically removed. At 8 a.m. sharp, my phone rang. It was Arthur Sterling. "Julian's bail was denied," Arthur stated, his voice as crisp and unfeeling as freshly printed currency. "Given the magnitude of the wire fraud and the fact that he possesses multiple offshore accounts, the routing numbers of which we kindly provided to the federal prosecutor, the judge deemed him an extreme flight risk. He spent the night in a federal holding cell. I am told his custom tuxedo is looking quite worse for wear." I took a slow sip of my tea. "And the rest of the family?" "Richard and Margaret have barricaded themselves in their townhouse. The society papers and the financial press caught wind of the spectacle at the Pierre Hotel. There are news vans parked outside their door. Richard tried to call his private wealth manager this morning to liquidate his pension and move funds to the Caymans." Arthur paused, allowing a rare beat of dramatic effect. His manager informed him that per the Global Consolidation Trust agreement he signed 48 hours ago, all his assets are frozen and solely under the administrative control of Clara Hayes. He is, for all intents and purposes, financially paralyzed. A genuine smile touched my lips. "Excellent. What's our next move?" "We have a visitor," Arthur said, his tone shifting into something slightly more predatory. "She bypassed the receptionist and is currently sitting in my conference room, demanding to speak with you." She says it's a matter of life and death for her children. I didn't need him to say the name. I set my teacup down. Give me 30 minutes. Keep her waiting. When I walked into Arthur's glass-walled conference room, Bethany Ann Vance was pacing the length of the floor. Stripped of the warm, glowing lighting of the Cresthaven dining room, she looked haggard. She was wearing a beige trench coat, her blonde hair pulled back in a messy bun, her face scrubbed clean of makeup. She was playing the role of the desperate, innocent mother to the hilt. The moment I entered, she stopped pacing. Her eyes filled with well-practiced tears, and she took a step toward me, her hands clasped together in a pleading gesture. "Clara," she breathed, her voice trembling. "Oh my God, Clara, I am so sorry. You have to believe me. I had no idea. I didn't know you existed until the FBI raided our house at 2 a.m. Julian told me his business was booming. He told me he was traveling for clients. I swear on my children's lives I thought I was his only wife." I didn't say a word. I walked to the head of the long mahogany table, pulled out a leather chair, and sat down, crossing my legs. Arthur stood silently in the corner, his hands folded behind his back, watching the performance with the detached interest of a scientist observing a lab rat. "He lied to both of us, Clara," Bethany sobbed, pulling a tissue from her pocket and dabbing at her eyes. "He's a monster, but please, you have to understand my position. The federal agents seized our bank accounts. I have 2 small children. I can't pay the electric bill. I can't buy groceries. And now I'm getting notices that the deed to my home, the house my babies grew up in, is tied up in some trust you control. Punish Julian, please. But don't put me and my children on the street. We are victims just like you." She looked at me with wide, tear-filled eyes, waiting for the empathy that women are conditioned to give. She was banking on the sisterhood of shared trauma. She expected me to soften, to see her as a fellow casualty of a cruel man. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table. "Arthur," I said quietly, never breaking eye contact with Bethany, "would you please show Mrs. Vance the Apex ledgers?" Arthur stepped forward and laid a thick black binder on the table. He flipped it open. "Julian is a creature of habit, Bethany," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, echoing loudly in the silent room. "He kept meticulous records on an encrypted hard drive, but he didn't just keep financial ledgers. He backed up his emails. He backed up his text messages, all the way back to the very beginning." The tears in Bethany's eyes suddenly stopped falling. The trembling in her hands ceased. A microscopic shift occurred in her posture, a subtle hardening of her spine. "When Arthur and I started digging," I continued, tracing a finger over the top document in the binder, "we didn't just find where the money went. We found where the plan came from. I always wondered how Julian knew exactly what to say to me when we met, how he knew my favorite flowers were white peonies, how he knew I was terrified of failing my grandfather, how he knew the exact psychological buttons to press to make an orphaned 23-year-old girl hand over her power of attorney." I slid a printed email across the polished wood. It was dated 9.5 years ago, 6 months before Julian bumped into me at a charity gala. The sender was Bethany. The recipient was Julian. The subject line was, "Target acquired, Hayes Logistics." "You didn't just know about me, Bethany," I said, the coldness in my voice dropping the temperature in the room. "You chose me." Bethany stared at the piece of paper, her jaw tightening. The facade of the weeping mother was cracking, revealing the absolute rot underneath. "You read about my grandfather's death in the Wall Street Journal," I read from a second sheet of paper. "You researched my net worth. You sent Julian to that charity gala with a script. She's young, she's grieving, she has no immediate family to run interference. Play the protective businessman. Get her to sign over the portfolio." That was your direct quote, Bethany. You weren't the clueless wife sitting at home. You were the architect of the entire operation. Bethany stammered, the color draining from her face. "That's taken out of context. We were in massive debt back then. Julian said it was just a business maneuver." "A business maneuver?" I laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. I tossed another stack of emails onto the table. "You dictated the budget, Bethany. You sent Julian lists of how much money to siphon from my accounts each month. Take $15,000 this month. Clara won't notice. Her logistics dividend just cleared. I need it for the kitchen renovation. You bought your children's Christmas presents with my dead grandfather's money. You lived like a queen on the blood of another woman, and you had the audacity to walk in here and ask for my mercy?" Bethany's expression finally morphed from fake panic to genuine venomous hatred. The mask was off. She glared at me, her chest heaving. You had more money than you knew what to do with. You were a stupid, naive little girl who practically handed him the checkbook. We built a real family. You were just a bank, and now the bank is closed, I said softly. I stood up. You have exactly 48 hours to pack your personal belongings and vacate the property at Cresthaven. If you are still in that house on Friday morning, I will have the county sheriff physically throw you and your belongings onto the curb. I do not care where you go. I do not care how you feed yourself. But you will never see another dime of my money as long as you live. You can't do this, Bethany screamed, slamming her hands on the table. I'll go to the press. I'll tell them you're a monster. Go ahead, Arthur interjected smoothly, closing the binder. But understand this. The federal prosecutor has a copy of these emails. You are currently an unindicted co-conspirator. If you make a single public statement, or if you refuse to vacate the property, I will personally ensure the Department of Justice files racketeering and wire fraud charges against you by the end of the week. You won't just lose the house, Mrs. Vance. You will lose your children to the foster care system when you go to federal prison. Choose your next move very carefully. Bethany looked between me and Arthur. She realized with crushing finality that she had brought a knife to a nuclear war. Without another word, she grabbed her purse, turned on her heel, and practically ran out of the conference room. I sat back down, taking a deep breath. 1 parasite down, 3 to go. But I didn't have to hunt the rest of the Vance family, because when criminals are backed into a corner, they do the work for you. They turn on each other. The very next afternoon, Beatrice Vance walked into Arthur's office. She looked nothing like the arrogant, jewel-draped woman who had mocked me at the anniversary party. She wore oversized sunglasses, a scarf wrapped tightly around her head, and she jumped at every shadow. She looked like a hunted animal. I need an immunity deal, Beatrice blurted out the second the conference room door closed. She didn't even look at me. Her eyes were locked onto Arthur. I know Julian is going down. I know the FBI is looking at the trust documents. I can give you Richard. I can give you my own father. I watched my sister-in-law, the woman who had helped me pick out my wedding dress, willingly offer her father's head on a silver platter to save her own skin. The sheer lack of loyalty was staggering. There was no honor among thieves, and there certainly wasn't any love in the Vance family. Richard was the mastermind of the shell companies, Beatrice said rapidly, pulling a small digital voice recorder from her designer handbag. Julian was too stupid to set up the offshore routing. My father did it. He forced me to sign as a witness. He threatened to cut me out of his will if I didn't help launder Clara's money. Arthur raised a silver eyebrow, clearly amused by the betrayal. That is quite an accusation, Beatrice. The federal prosecutors will require more than just your word to offer any sort of leniency. I have proof, Beatrice hissed, her hands shaking as she pushed the recorder across the glass desk. Last night, after the news broke, my parents were panicking in the townhouse. My father started shredding documents in his study. I walked in with this recorder in my pocket. I asked him what we were going to do. He admitted to everything on tape. He admitted to forging the tax declarations. He admitted to using Clara's corporate accounts to fund his own pension. And he explicitly told me to lie to the FBI if they came knocking. She looked at me, her eyes pleading, desperate. Clara, please. I was manipulated. They are my parents. I couldn't say no. I'll testify against them in federal court. I'll give this tape to the DOJ. Just promise me you won't take my condo and my trust fund. Let me walk away. I stared at the small black recorder on the table. It was the final nail in the coffin. Beatrice had just handed me the weapon that would guarantee her parents spent their twilight years completely destitute, if not behind bars. And she was doing it for a condo and a few leased cars. I appreciate your cooperation, Beatrice, Arthur said smoothly, picking up the recorder and slipping it into his suit pocket. I will personally hand-deliver this to the lead prosecutor. If the audio is as conclusive as you claim, I imagine they will look favorably upon your cooperation regarding the criminal charges. Beatrice let out a massive sigh of relief, slumping into her chair. Thank God. Thank you, Clara. I knew you were a reasonable woman. However, Arthur continued, his voice dropping an octave, taking on the deadly, flat tone of an executioner. The Department of Justice only handles criminal immunity. They do not handle civil asset forfeiture. Beatrice froze. What do you mean? I leaned forward, looking my sister-in-law dead in the eye, that keeping you out of a federal prison is the prosecutor's decision. But taking back every single dime you stole from me, that is my decision. But I gave you my father! Beatrice panicked, her voice pitching into a shrill shriek. We had a deal. We have no deal, I said coldly. You signed the master trust agreement 2 days ago, Beatrice. You legally pledged your condo, your cars, and your accounts as collateral. You didn't come here today out of guilt or remorse. You came here because you are a coward trying to sacrifice your parents so you can keep living your luxury lifestyle. The tape keeps you out of handcuffs, but you are still going to lose everything. You lying bitch! Beatrice lunged forward, but Arthur was faster. He pressed a button under his desk, and 2 massive security guards stepped into the room immediately. Escort Ms. Vance from the premises, Arthur instructed calmly. If she returns, have her arrested for trespassing. Beatrice was dragged out of the office, kicking and screaming obscenities, her oversized sunglasses flying off her face. The sound of her wailing echoed down the hallway until the elevator doors finally slid shut. I sat back in my chair, the silence returning to the room. The puzzle was complete. Julian was in jail. Bethany was being evicted. Beatrice had betrayed her parents, and Richard had confessed on tape. The Vance family hadn't just been defeated, they had destroyed themselves from the inside out. Well, Arthur said, adjusting his cuffs perfectly, I believe it is time to go to court. The wheels of justice are notoriously slow, but when driven by a man like Arthur Sterling and fueled by an airtight paper trail, they can crush everything in their path with terrifying efficiency. The next 8 months of my life were spent in and out of sterile federal courtrooms and oak-paneled civil tribunals. I did not shed a single tear in front of a judge. I wore sharp, tailored suits in charcoal and navy. I sat beside Arthur, a statue of quiet, undeniable power, watching the Vance family try to squirm out of the trap they had built for themselves. The criminal trial came first. The federal prosecutors didn't even need me to testify for very long. Beatrice's audio recording was the centerpiece of the prosecution's case. Sitting in the gallery and watching Richard Vance's face as his own voice echoed through the courtroom, admitting to tax fraud, money laundering, and conspiring to conceal a bigamous marriage, was a masterclass in watching a man's soul leave his body. He aged 20 years in the span of a 3-minute audio clip. Julian tried to play the charming, misunderstood businessman to the jury. His defense attorney attempted to paint me as a vindictive, controlling heiress who had forced Julian to hide his past out of fear. But Arthur had anticipated that. He handed the prosecutor the emails Bethany had written, the ones where she plotted to target me like a corporate acquisition. When the prosecutor read those emails aloud, detailing the exact amounts Julian was ordered to steal from my accounts to pay for his secret children's private schools, the jury's faces hardened into stone. You can forgive a man who makes a mistake for love. You do not forgive a predator who hunts for sport. The verdicts were swift and brutal. Julian Robert Vance was found guilty of wire fraud, bank fraud, tax evasion, and felony bigamy. The judge, a stern woman in her late 60s who looked at Julian with the kind of disgust usually reserved for vermin, did not offer a shred of leniency. She sentenced him to 10 years in federal prison. When the bailiffs led him away in handcuffs, he didn't look back at me. His arrogance had finally been replaced by the crushing reality of a concrete cell. Richard Vance, thanks to his age and a sudden, highly convenient heart condition, avoided prison time. He was given 5 years of federal probation. However, the judge slapped him with a criminal restitution order so massive it would have bankrupted a small country. Margaret Vance, complicit but shielded slightly by her husband's overbearing control of the finances, was given 3 years of probation. But keeping them out of a jail cell was just the appetizer. The civil trial was the main course, and Arthur Sterling was the head chef. Because Julian's marriage to me was never legal, and because every single asset the Vance family acquired over the last 8 years was tainted by fraud and bought with my stolen funds, Arthur argued that the Hayes Vance Global Syndicate Trust, the trap they had so greedily signed, was completely valid and enforceable. The civil judge agreed. The gavel came down, and in an instant the Vance family was entirely wiped off the map. The Cresthaven estate was legally transferred into my name. Bethany Vance had exactly 48 hours to vacate. I drove up there on the day of her eviction, parking my car down the street, just as I had on Thanksgiving. I watched moving trucks haul away her furniture. I watched her herd her children into a rented sedan, her face pale and drawn. I felt a brief flicker of pity for the children. They didn't ask to be born into a web of lies. But I did not feel an ounce of pity for Bethany. She had gambled with another woman's life to fund her own, and she had lost. She moved into a small 2-bedroom apartment in a neighboring state, entirely dependent on government assistance, as every dollar in her bank accounts had been seized. Beatrice's immunity deal kept her out of federal prison, but it didn't save her from Arthur. Using the civil forfeiture ruling, we seized her luxury condo, liquidated her offshore accounts, and repossessed her leased vehicles. The woman who used to mock my work ethic at country club luncheons was forced to move into a tiny studio apartment in Queens and get a job as a receptionist at a dental clinic just to pay her basic utility bills. As for Richard and Margaret, they were the architects of their own private hell. The civil judgment wiped out Richard's pension, his savings, and the equity in their pristine townhouse. They were forced to declare Chapter 11 bankruptcy. They had to sell the townhouse at a massive loss just to pay their mounting legal fees. They moved into a modest, cramped rental unit on the outskirts of the city. Margaret Vance, the woman who loved to parade around in pearls and brag about her family's prestige, was abruptly dropped by every single one of her high society friends. The country club revoked their membership. Their names became toxic. They were left with nothing but each other, trapped in a tiny apartment, blaming one another for the greed that had cost them their empire. Which brings me to today. I am standing on the wraparound porch of the Cresthaven estate. The air is crisp, hinting at the approaching autumn. The landscaping still looks immaculate, though I have fired Oak Ridge Premier Landscaping and hired a local company that charges a fraction of the price. I am not keeping the house. It's too big, and its walls are soaked in the ghosts of a family that never really existed. Tomorrow, a high-end real estate broker is coming to list the property. It will sell for millions, and every single cent will go straight back into my grandfather's logistics company, funding a new scholarship program for young women entering the corporate sector. I am 32 years old. I have my company, I have my wealth, and most importantly, I have my absolute freedom. When people hear my story, they often ask me how I survived it. How do you recover from the realization that the man you slept next to for 8 years, the family you broke bread with, were all actors in a play designed to destroy you? The answer is simple, and it's the reason I am speaking to you now. You survive by realizing that your intuition is your greatest weapon. Women are taught from a very young age to be accommodating. We are taught to be polite, to suppress our doubts, to smile and nod when a man explains our own finances to us. We are told that our suspicions are just paranoia, that we are overthinking, that we should just focus on making the home a happy place. That conditioning is a trap. It is a blindfold they tie over your eyes while they pick your pockets. If you are listening to this, and you have that heavy, cold feeling in the pit of your stomach, if you notice the numbers don't add up, if his business trips always seem to happen on holidays, if his family's smiles never quite reach their eyes, do not ignore it. Do not let them tell you that you are crazy. Do not let them convince you that you are just being insecure. You are not paranoid. You are perceptive. And your perception is the only thing standing between you and absolute ruin. Do what I did. Step back into the shadows. Let them think you are blind. Let them think you are complacent. Gather your evidence in the dark. Find your own Arthur Sterling, someone cold, calculating, and entirely on your side. Build your armor, lock the doors, and when the time is right, you don't just confront them. You don't just ask for an apology or cry over what you've lost. You burn their lies to the ground, and you take back exactly what belongs to you. My name is Clara Hayes. I was a target. I was a victim, but I refuse to be a casualty. Thank you for listening. Trust yourselves, ladies. The truth is always worth the fight.